In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of using an N-tier architecture and also the rules you have to follow when you're using N-tier. So let me start with a demo. So I have Graph TV up here, and it's sort of the big brother of the demo UI program we were looking at in previous videos. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit the Run button. And here it is. So we have a main screen. It's got an About tab. There's a title search where I can do incremental search for titles that match. So this is just doing a keyword search over the title. And then let me make this a little bit smaller. If I select one of these titles, that lights up the Show Episode Ratings button. I can go ahead and look at the overall episode ratings. I can hover over each episode. It will give me information about the episode, season, episode in the season, rating, number of votes, and so on. I can also click on an episode. So like if I want to know more about the highest rated episode of Westworld, at least when this particular database was put together, I can go ahead and click right there. And that takes me to a web browser, shows me the episode. I can also go to top rated, and this is just like what we were doing with demo UI. So the top rated TV series in the science animation genre is Rick and Morty. And if I show episode ratings, the best episode of Rick and Morty, at least up through season 3, is the Rick Lantis mix-up, according to IMDb viewers. So, pretty straightforward application. The thing that makes it a little interesting is I'm going to go over to Android Emulator, Genymotion Android Emulator, and I'm going to go ahead and run the Graph TV app here. And I'm going to go ahead and do a title search. And we'll do Westworld. And let's go ahead and view the episodes for Westworld. And let's go ahead and hover over various episodes. And let's click on the little bubble to go to the IMDb page for that. It's running emulated, so not particularly fast, but works pretty well on a real Android device. And I can also go to top rated. And do a search for all, let's do movies this time, best animated movies. And let's go and look at the Spirited Away IMDb page. And so on. So the interesting thing about the code bases for these two apps is that the only thing that's different is the presentation layer. So both applications have the same business logic, and they access data the same way, so the same data package. And if we look at the IntelliJ project for the Graph TV application, what we see is that there's a data package that has a couple of different methods for accessing the data. So one data method is to go directly to the database. So here's something like what we had in demo UI. And then there are various queries that it knows about, and there's a connect method. This one's a little bit more complicated because it handles some cases that we don't handle in demo UI, like the connection timing out and so on. But the gist of it's the same. It does the same has static methods that you can call that will do database searches and wrap the results up as array lists of business class objects and so on. And then, in addition to this database layer, there's alternatively a web data layer, a web data implementation, I should say. And the actual methods are, the public methods are the same. So just like there was a find shows by ID in the database class, there's a find shows by ID in the web data class. And same thing with fetch episodes and fetch genres and so on. So all of these methods have the same interface, but the implementation is different. So for this particular one, what it's doing is going through a PHP front end to the database that I have running on my database server instead of connecting directly to the database. So when you're talking to the data layer, the only thing that matters is the interface that's presented by database and the interface that's presented by web data. And if they're the same interface, then they can be used interchangeably. And then the only code that knows about the code in the data layer is in the logic layer. So let's look at genre, for example, and this is really similar to what we had in demo UI. So there's a genre class with a string mname property. I use a slightly different convention here. And there's a constructor and a getter. And then there's a static method called fetch genres, which is the same thing as fetch all genres in the demo UI. And all it's doing is it's calling a static method called fetch genres in the data layer, in the web data specifically. So all I would need to do to change this logic code to use the database implementation instead of the web data implementation is change this object right here, or actually this class, from being the web data class to being the database class. And if I look at episode, I see the same kind of thing. So here's an episode, fetch episodes, which takes an ID string. It wraps up the results as an array list of episode objects, and it calls webdata.fetchEpisodes. If I change that to database.fetchEpisodes, it would do the right thing. It would just go directly to the database instead of going through a web front end. And all of the classes in the data layer are set up the same way. They all have basically a call that goes to either the web data object or class or the database class. Now, if I move into the presentation layer, here's where I start getting the actual classes and forms that are bound up with the Java version of this using the GUI builder and Swing. So let's look at the top rated form. So here's the top rated form, and it has the same kind of thing we had in demo UI. There's two combo boxes and a text box where I can type in the minimum number of shows. I think I used a different order here. I think I had genre first and type second in demo UI, and I have them the other way around here. But same JTable, same buttons at the bottom. And if I look at this code, any code that I have in the presentation package is going to be going through the logic package. So there's only going to be GUI code in here, and it's only going to use classes and methods in the logic package. Never goes directly to the data layer. And the reason is because if I want to change what I'm using the data layer, I know that all I have to do is edit the code in the logic class, switch over from web data to database or vice versa. I know I don't need to look at any of the code in the presentation layer because the presentation layer is always going through the logic layer to get the data. So that's why I was creating those static methods on the logic layer classes, like fetch all genres and fetch all types, because that way the presentation layer is going through the logic layer, and the logic layer is going to the database layer, and that's what lets me switch these around easily if I want to talk to a web interface or a database interface. Now, if I look at the Android version of the application in Android Studio, I see much the same thing. So this database class here is exactly the same as the database class that I was just looking at in IntelliJ, because I'm talking to the same database. And this web implementation is also the same as the web data implementation, as I saw before. These logic classes are all the same because the logic is the same, and I could switch them to talk to the database just by changing the class where I'm calling that static method. Same thing here, and same thing here. And the only thing that's different is this presentation layer. So this is quite a bit different because the API for developing applications on Android is pretty different from what you see with the GUI builder and Swing. So there's some adapters to basically make the code work the same on both interfaces. And then this stuff here in main, that's also different as well, because on Android, you have activities which correspond to Windows. In Swing, you have JFrames which correspond to Windows. So there's some difference there. But all of the differences are in this presentation layer in the main package. So that's what allows me to reuse all of the code in the data layer and all of the code in the logic layer, even with two pretty different versions of the application. So the key rules here are all the code that talks to the database should be in the data layer. All of the code that has to do with the GUI and listening for events and handling events and presentation and drawing and stuff like that, that goes in the presentation layer and this main package, which sort of does the same, which sort of kicks it all off. And then the code that binds it together, that all lives in the logic package. The presentation layer can only talk to code in the logic layer. The logic layer is the only package that is allowed to talk to the data layer. And then the logic layer methods and the data layer methods wrap up the data and return it to the presentation layer where it can be displayed.